Hey guys, what's going on? This is Brad from the Ed Army, and today I want to talk to you really quick about Terminal World and why it's so important for Yu-Gi-Oh! As a whole. Now, before I get into it, like, comment, and subscribe. I'm trying to grow up the channel, and we are on the race to 100 subs, so be a part of that and the first 100 members of the ranks, and put yourself down and subscribe today. Also, don't forget to turn on your notification bell. It's free, and it helps you because more content's coming, and I don't plan on stopping. So basically, I want to talk about Terminal World, and the reason why I want to talk about Terminal World is actually why it's very significant for the TCG and the OCG as a whole, basically the whole game. So for those of you guys wondering, I don't really need to describe what Terminal World is because there's a lot of videos on what Terminal World is. The briefest thing I'll just say is that it's basically legacy support for all the decks or certain decks from the Terminal or Dual Terminal saga. So it's basically a large lore that's existed for a good period of time. Now, biggest reason I want to talk about Terminal World and why it's so significant is the fact of what it's doing. So the reason what it's doing is that it's giving actually very good support to the decks in these or in the pack itself. So far, we've only seen a few of them, being Ice Barrier and Infernoid in their whole, as well as the release of new Gen X support. Now, the biggest reason I want to talk about these, even before I think the speculations are getting Ritual Beasts, is basically why they're so important. So, effectively, for Terminal World as a whole, it's basically showing that Konami has the capability to print and complete archetypes that have been, in my opinion, otherwise completely useless and or abandoned. Now, some people would argue that they tried to give support to these decks in different ways. Some were actually meta level at some point, or rogue in different areas. Something like Infernoids and the Ritual Beasts were meta for a while. This also is not very apparent for something like Gen X and Ice Barriers, but what it shows me is that Konami's actually looking and designing around these old archetypes to actually get them to where they need to be. Now, I'm not saying that they're going to be tier 1 or tier 0 threats, but it's fixing a lot of the problems these archetypes either had or increasing the power that they needed in order to compete in the modern day. In the case of the Infernoids, their fusion monster, as well as their additional support that they received, has absolutely made them a threat again. And once they're released here in the TCG, I do think there'll be experimentation. In the case of Ice Barriers, this is a strategy that had definitely needed to be completed because it was almost on the cusp of being playable. However, it was still too inconsistent to really get off on its feet. Now it actually has play lines and has new ways of interacting with the opponent that were desperately needed, and now it received it. Now, in the case of something like Gen X, they were completely unplayable. However, I think the support here shows that Gen X and basically any of the really bad dual terminal archetypes that exist, Konami could easily fix it. And I do mean that because with the support that Gen X received, they gave them an insanely broken Link monster that actually fixes the problems in the deck and doesn't make it too generic, as although people could try to play a more generic toolbox variant of the Gen X strategy, it's not as efficient as it could be. And in the case of their support and their new level 10 boss synchro monster, the deck actually can play now. It's really fantastic, actually. My point more of Terminal World is to explain that Konami's actually giving us something that we've wanted for a long time, which is finally delivering some of these archetypes that have existed for an arguably large amount of time that have been just absolutely garbage for the most part because they're just unplayable. I mean, if we have to look at something like Gen X, their biggest problem was that they didn't really have too many plays and they couldn't really cohesively work together as an archetype, which is kind of funny considering that they were all meant to be in an archetype. But the point is, we finally have them completed. Now, what does this mean for us as a whole? We can only really speculate as what we can be seeing in the future if we get another Terminal World. I do think this first one is so far being a real good banger of a set and really delivering on what they wanted to do by giving us archetypes that needed the support. Now, my main reason for this being really good for Yu-Gi-Oh! As a whole is that there's a lot of talks usually about designing for archetypes where we need new strategies, right? But there's a lot of these underused and unappreciated strategies that just simply needed more, support, more direct fixing to get them going. And now they have it. And I do think this is really good to see because a lot of times it was very discouraging to try to pick up some of these old sets because basically a lot of us knew that this archetype or these archetypes would just never be completed and they wouldn't be finished. But now with Terminal World showing what we could do, even for something like Gen X, which is I think arguably been the biggest proponent of being like a junk archetype from Terminal World, is now that Konami could literally just fix the problems whenever they feel like it. It's actually really interesting to see that this is the case because it basically allows us to know that we can at least expect a little bit more from Konami. They're really trying to give us something new and interesting, even if it's from something very old and maybe could be meta warping. I don't think these archetypes are necessarily too broken on their own, but it's something that I like that Konami probably needs to find a solution for in the future, which is making decks playable. When you have decks that just aren't playable, it really sucks because a lot of times you just don't necessarily care about playing, but you just really want to focus more on the fact that these archetypes need some type of closure, is the way I would say. They just need some way to like actually be useful. Because a lot of people, a lot of players will just abandon certain archetypes because what's the point of playing it if it's not going to do anything? And in the case of the ones that we saw in Terminal World, some of them were good, some of them were just completely unplayable until now, and some have just been fixed to actually do something. So, at the end of this discussion, Terminal World is a monumental set for Yu-Gi-Oh! Based solely on the fact that it's arguably one of the best legacy supporting sets in terms of completing completely useless archetypes. Now, that's all I have for you guys today. If you disagree with the points I said today, well, yeah, I could see it. But still, Terminal World's a fantastic set, and I do hope that you guys are excited for it as well. So that's all I've got today, guys. I'm Brad from the Ed Army signing off. And for all of you out there to sign on.